right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and start chapter 8, and that's going to be the one on education. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history of segregation in education in the U.S. We're going to talk a little bit about indigenous schools, and then we're also going to talk about current realities for those in educational settings right now. All right. So the U.S. education system, the first really notable education system, or the first time we really found somebody that actually was overseeing a board of education or creating any kind of standards, I guess, was in Massachusetts in 1837. Over the course of history, or U.S. history, Chinese, Mexican, and African American students have all attended segregated schools. Indigenous individuals also have, but their schools were assimilation schools, and they were a bit different than some of the other ones that we're going to talk about. The Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 decided that the separate but equal mentality that was Jim Crow was essentially based upon was unconstitutional when it came to school, and that provoked the Little Rock Nine that ended up, and that's a picture of what this is over here, that were the first unsegregated schools in some of the states in the South. Now, some of the northern states had some unsegregated schools for a good period of time at this point, but even those, generally any education systems that served any racial minority also had less resources and had a harder time finding teachers and had things of that nature. Prior to Board versus Education, which is the one that is more commonly known, you had Mendez versus Westminster, and that's down here. And that was in 1947, which was really talking about the segregation of Latino children and as unconstitutional. And so we're talking about 7 years prior to Brown versus Board of Education. There was ruling for Latino children to be able to be admitted into white public school systems. All right, so literacy was kept from many different different groups at different periods in U.S. history for extended periods of time, because that allowed for a population that was less likely to know the rights that they weren't getting, or less like, not to know them, they knew them, but less likely to have ways to communicate or to communicate resistance to those policies. And one of the unintended consequences of Brown versus Education is that in schoolhouses that were segregated, African-American students and Black students were taught significant amounts of civil rights, not civil rights, what's the word I'm looking for? Political processes, and it's not the word I'm looking for either. Civics, there we go. Civics classes, in order to better understand how their right to vote was being infringed, what they needed to do to create that, to rectify that dynamic, and how to really get students enthused about that. And what that did is create a generation that was more educated in that process. But when Brown versus Board of Education created that or that unconstitutional ruling of separate but equal, and those schools started to integrate, which to an extent they still don't, but what ended up having is a lot of civics classes got taken away, and or Black students weren't always taught by Black teachers, and so their particular social settings, their particular social consequences, their particular social oppressions weren't necessarily something that were taught. The perspectives weren't there. There were a lot of things that just were missing in the educational system for Black students once those school systems were integrated. On top of that, we also we're seeing a lot of this happen as Black people lost the right to vote Black men lost the right to vote in the early 20th century. And in many states, they reshaped their schools with social moments, again, focused and lacking, but they lacked serious amounts of resources in these schools. And so talking about things that were realistic to them, as opposed to doing the same kind of ability to do like maybe the written work because you didn't have enough pencils or enough paper or what have you. And that care work was specifically on teachers that were getting paid significantly less. In 1968, 40% of Mexican origin students in Texas were attending schools that were 80% or more Mexican. And in 2001, 40% of Latino students and 31% of Black students in the South attended schools where less than 10% were white. So there's still a significant amount of segregation. When you look over here, it goes all the way up to 2018. And this renewed trend towards their percentage of population within the schools, depending on the area, right? And essentially what you're looking at is this here's why. Okay, we'll get into that first. Housing segregation or neighborhood segregation is a continued issue. And because neighborhoods get segregated, then the schools that go with them tend to be segregated as well. Not to mention that the poor neighborhoods end up with poor schools because they don't have as much local taxes going into that, feeding into that system. Now, that system isn't inherently equal, but that is currently how our system operates. Economic disparities in wealth and opportunity. Again, that's going to tie back to depending on where you are location wise in a city. It's going to depend on the school you go to. It's going to depend on the resources that you have. It's going to depend on the extracurricular activities and or the options you have for being able to say maybe be in advanced classes or attend dual credit classes for college, or et cetera, et cetera. Districting pretty much determines a lot of this. And districting ends up being very creative in its ways to outline particular neighborhoods to cut out people that white people don't want in their schools and or don't want, and or to make it more profitable to give resources to white schools as opposed to schools that are predominantly people of color. Then you have the funding rules for each of these districts, which again, I was just talking about, and then the private versus public funding packages. So you're going to also see a significant portion of white students making up the populations of private schools and far less people of color in those private institutions, which generally have a significantly more resources. Again, so we still deal with this issue, and as long as we set up our school systems the way they are and our districting the way we do, we're going to continue to have issues when it comes to the proportion of students via race as in ratios. And that's going to create continued economic disadvantages for those in minorities because they're going to have fewer resources, and fewer resources equal fewer teachers, equal more students crammed in a classroom, equal less advanced learning, and less extracurriculars, all of those things. And we talked a little bit about the educational problems when it comes to class-based operations too. All right, so we're going to talk about these. These are called Indian schools. I don't like that term, so I don't tend to use it. It is a derogatory term, but that is what these schools were as well. They were based on assimilation practices and culturally genocidal in a sense that they were taking away the indigenous practices of these children and converting their religion to primarily Christianity, primarily Roman Catholic, and were not allowing language, dress, any kind of physical appearance that related them back to their indigenous culture. This right down here is a picture of a before and after, and kind of really explaining that indigenous discrepancy. And we're going to talk a little bit about this when we talk about the gentleman who wrote the section in the being indigenous, that is talking about Inuit knowledge. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these practices. But these boardings, they happened in 3 different ways. They were either boarding schools on reservations, which were less frequent, except for in states like Oklahoma, where there was a significant amount of reservations. Boarding schools outside of the reservations, day school and day schools. Boarding schools outside the reservations generally were the harshest because these included kidnapping and the taking of children from their families and putting them into schools with where they didn't speak the same language, where they weren't allowed to dress the way they were, where they weren't allowed to talk to each other in their language of choice, etc. And this is kind of the map right here. I have another map in the other section that shows kind of, or another list coming up here in just a second, that shows kind of where those were, and the fact that there are still currently some operating, which is mind-boggling, but it shows the level to which we sweep Indigenous people under the rug, and our history and continued oppression of Indigenous people in the US under the rug. The main missions for this was to conservation to Christianity. And there was a significant amount of trauma that was a part of these particular schools. This included things such as violence, sexual assault, murder, physical assault, neglect, making children sleep outside in tents, even though there were school buildings and dorms, doing a lot of the manual labor, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a lot of trauma due to family separation as well. Versions of these, again, still exist, and they did so much harm. And the person who actually founded some of the very first ones of these, essentially their motto for these schools were killing the Indian and saving the man, which in and of itself is denoting the humanity of Indigenous people and the personhood that is someone who is non-Christian. And so think about it as that. Now, a lot of these have been talked about more recently as these sites are getting becoming archaeological places to repatriate, especially the ones in Canada, to repatriate the bodies of the murdered students, so that they can go back to the families, go back to the culture, so they can essentially give them the burials that are culturally appropriate, and give these people back to their parents who may still be living, and or to, which again shows how recently this is. All right, so on this one, this is the list of the 367 schools by state. You'll notice that there's some states that are not in here. That does not say that never did they have these particular schools, but that their records may not be there, especially given where some of those states are. There are 14 denominations of Christianity, all of Christianity, that particularly were parts of these schools. Primarily, they were Roman Catholic. The 5 top states were Oklahoma, Arizona, Alaska, New Mexico, and South Dakota, which also happened to be areas where there were more reservations. So that's not shocking. 73 still remain open today, and this is as of, I think, 2020. And 15 were still boarding children away from families. So this is not something that is good. This is not something that should not be taught in our schools, but it's something that a lot of people don't know existed. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about affirmative action real quick. So as part of the 1968 Civil Rights Movement, Title VI enabled colleges and universities to take affirmative action to enhance racial diversity on campus. And one of the ways they did this was through affirmative action. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and play this while we're in this YouTube video because it is a YouTube video and that seems a little silly. But I need you to go watch this, because if you click on this, it will be part of the affirmative action, and it will kind of explain what affirmative action actually is, where it goes from here, and give you a better understanding of what its purpose is. And I think it does it in a pretty comprehensive and easy to flow through way. In schools with affirmative action programs, admissions committees can consider the racial diversity of applicants as one factor in their decision to admit a student to a university. That's not to say that's the only, by a long stretch. So they still have to meet all the criteria that a white student would have to meet. But what this essentially is there to do is to create or support more diverse campuses, and to make sure that students of color, despite the fact that they again tend to come from schools of lower resources or from lower economic resources in general, are part of higher education. And its job is to make sure that it's essentially compensating and helping to make better some of the economic differences and the long time history of wealth distribution in this country. And this is kind of why, right? The median white household is 13 times as much wealth as the median Black household, and 10 times as much as the median Hispanic household. So these are essentially your bars, right? That in and of itself is going to say that primarily the individuals or households that are going to have the funds to be able to send their kids to college is going to be white households. And that in and of itself proves or creates higher education systems that are primarily white. Of African Americans, 65% were excluded from the benefits of the Social Security when Social Security began. And of the 67,000 that got to do GI bills, only fewer than 100 of them were non-white applicants. So these systems that were put in place in the 1950s, and even if you talk about higher education systems, the 1920s and 30s, where college was much more affordable, even free in some places, they still didn't necessarily admit and or were, like, some of them was against social policy at the time, or even state policy at the time, to include Black people, or Chinese people, and or Latina people, or Latino people, right? So this created an issue, and it created an issue where primarily those who had economic advantage were coming from white households, because white households were more educated. And so in order to kind of curve this, or to kind of compensate for this, and wanting to make the system a little more a little better for people of color, affirmative action was created. And so right down here, there's also a really fun graphic about the 5 myths about affirmative action. And that's just that few Americans support affirmative action. That's not true. 71% of Americans actually support affirmative action at what its core meaning is. A lot of people don't know what that is on occasion. And then race-based affirmative action is primarily used by colleges and universities, and that's not actually true. It's anything that is government funded or a government institution. So it's not just colleges and universities, but it's also much more than that. And then race-based affirmative action, let's see if I can read that, admits Black and Latino students at an unfair advantage over other students, which is not, again, accurate, because it's still less than 5% of Black, or less than 5% of students are Black, and less than 11% of students in college and universities across the country are Latino. So that doesn't track. And then culture can be considered colleges can consider income and not race in college admissions, and achieve similar results. While income-based approaches don't yield equal results when it comes to an increased number of Black and Brown faces on campus, they could provide, and we do this when it comes to certain kinds of governmental aid. So say grant money, things of that nature are based on income levels of parents and households. And so that can be helpful, but if you don't admit them, it still doesn't matter how much income they make, because the admissions process itself is necessary for college enrollment. And then the last thing is affirmative action is a non-issue because it only impacts a small percentage of students. And that's, again, America's most elite colleges produce a disproportionate percentage of our country's powerful who have influence of businesses, politics, and other aspects of society. So even if it was just these particular schools, which it's not, affirmative action has big impacts, because those schools without those perspectives are going to create and perpetuate racial inequality throughout society. And then the Supreme Court has recently talked a lot about affirmative action and has gotten one step closer to making affirmative action policies illegal. And so that's something to keep in mind and keep watching. And if you want to know more about that, I also added an NPR article that kind of talks through that particular Supreme Court case and what its opposition was. So I will make sure, again, to have that folder with all the links for all of this in it. And we're going to talk a little bit about educational outcomes. And does culture help us to understand why Asians do better at school than whites? And so there's some debate in this, right? So on one hand, there's cultural evidence that that some cultures value education more, or value educational access more, or receive more access. And that's true. On the other hand, there is also far more, like far less, I guess, social boundaries for Asian students than there are for some of the other demographics that are in the country. And that falls down into essentially because they are considered that model minority, which we talked about a little bit in the media section. And because their skin is generally much lighter and closer to white skin, there's the ability to kind of pass as white, or to create some more ability to think or to have less, I guess, obstacles in the way and more opportunities within academic settings. And then what evidence does the cultural, I have no idea what that's supposed to say, provide to dismantle? We'll go in here and look and see what I'm talking about. All right, yeah, I have no idea what I was trying to type there, but article provide to dismantle the model minority myth. And essentially, I am sure what this article was talking about, and will continue to talk about, is really that depending on what particular, that Asian Americans are not homogenous, and that depending on what particular nationality you also claim, or cultural variation you claim, will also dismantle some of that model minority status, right? So depending on if you're Vietnamese, you are much less likely to kind of carry that model minority myth, versus if you might be Japanese or Chinese. And Chinese even has its own level of discord given the political situations that America has on any given day. And then in 2015, Asian students scored on average 200 on reading tests, compared to 274 for whites, 256 for blacks, and 253 for Native Americans. How do we explain the fact that Asian and white students scored higher than Black and Latino students? And how do we explain that achievement gap? And here we're going to talk about rates of graduation as well. It's also over here at high school and college and at a college level. And so really what we're talking about there is going back to essentially this history of schools and whether or not you have the resources you need, whether or not you have these teaching capacities, whether or not you have stereotypes in your way, whether or not you have opportunities, whether or not you have extracurriculars, whether or not you have tutors available, whether or not you have the time and social capacity to be able to do any of these things. Because depending on if you're also carrying a job or you're also part of the family care work, or you're also watching your siblings and keeping up with their school, all of these things impact whether or not you have the ability to access proper education and can impact that achievement gap. And then on top of that, you also have testing that is particularly geared towards and is particularly geared towards white urban Americans. And so the way they word the test, the language they use, the examples they use are all geared towards those particular demographics. And then oppositional cultural argument is really this idea that essentially if you have this opposition to school, then you're not going to do well in school, and that you're going to, what's the exact term? Let me use the exact term or the exact definition that they used. So is that African American students don't do well in school because they equate school success with acting white, and that African American students have responded to widespread discrimination by developing an identity in opposition to white dominant culture, and thus the opposition to school success. On the flip side of that, and that argument doesn't really pan out when you talk to community members who talk about education as their only way out, or something that they don't get, or that they don't get to experience in the same way, or that they don't have opportunities to, or that they don't have time for. All of these things point to a need to make education more accessible, as opposed to consistently opposing education as a whole. Studies have also found that teachers are more likely to put white students in college prep tracks. Teachers are more likely to be white, and that they are more likely to feed into stereotypic ideas of students in general. And so that is also going to create this dynamic where teachers are going to support particularly white students more than they're going to support their students of colors. Hidden curriculum is also this idea that the school curriculum is designed to reflect cultural hegemony and ensure that the class in interest of the dominant group. So when you have these hidden curriculums, you're going to learn specifically that certain things are inherent to your school system, or certain things are the way they are. There's this hidden curriculum that Black students aren't going to do as well, so why give them as much energy, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that are going to be taught both to the teachers that are teaching in these programs, but also the students that are there. And then cultural and social capital. And cultural are the cultural resources, so essentially the ideas and social norms that make up a community and a culture. And the social capital, which is the relationships and networks, are also going to impact your ability to get into higher education, your ability to get into private schools, your ability to get into better schools, your ability to have opportunities in schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really the majority of what we're going to talk about for chapter 8, but then we're going to get into some of the being Indigenous and some of the brown enough, which are really going to get into education again, and some of the conversations about media. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there for now. I hope you guys are having a great week, and I will talk to you again soon.